Dorothy cooked for that family for 6 years. She learned how Richard liked his eggs, how Celeste took her coffee. She remembered Miles's birthday when his own siblings forgot it. She made Crestwood Manor feel like a home, and 3 weeks after William died, they handed her 2 suitcases, a set of keys, and told her to be gone by Friday. No discussion, no gratitude, not even the decency to look uncomfortable about it. Just Richard in that marble hallway, hands folded, telling her the arrangements had been made. She was 65 years old, and she had nowhere else to go. What Richard didn't know, what none of them knew, was that William had been watching everything, and he had been preparing for this exact moment for a very long time. Stay with this story, because what Dorothy finds changes everything. Dorothy Crane grew up with dirt under her fingernails and didn't consider that a hardship. The farm in Clarksville, Tennessee sat on 11 acres of red clay soil that her father had worked since before she was born. It wasn't prosperous land. It was stubborn land. The kind that gave you something if you were willing to get up before dawn and argue with it every single day. Dorothy argued with it happily. She was the middle of 3 children. Her older brother Carl handled the heavy work. Her younger sister Ruth handled everything else. Dorothy handled the gap between them, which in practice meant she handled most things, most of the time, without being asked. Her mother noticed. Her father didn't need to say it. That was simply how that family worked. She went to the local school, did well enough, came home every afternoon and changed out of her school clothes before her mother finished reminding her to. She had friends in town, but her closest company was the land itself. The particular smell of it after rain, the way the light fell across the lower field in October, the sound the wind made moving through the tree line at the eastern edge of the property. She knew that farm the way you know a person. She never planned to leave it. Life, as it tends to do, had other ideas. She married at 24. A local man named Gary Crane, decent, hardworking, genuinely fond of her in the uncomplicated way that some people are simply fond of each other without it ever quite becoming more than that. They had 13 years together. No children, which was a sadness they carried quietly and separately without ever finding the right words to carry it together. Gary died of a heart attack at 41, a Tuesday morning in March. Dorothy was in the kitchen when it happened, and she carried the particular cruelty of that timing, the absolute ordinariness of the moment before, but for a very long time afterward. She kept the farm running. Of course she did. She took on 2 part-time jobs in town to cover what the land couldn't. She kept Gary's tools exactly where he'd left them for almost a year before she moved them. She brought meals to her neighbor Edna every Thursday, because Edna was 83 and the walk to her own kitchen had become uncertain. People in Clarksville knew Dorothy Crane the way you know someone who simply shows up, reliably, quietly, without requiring acknowledgement. She was 52 when she met William. It was a Saturday in late September at the Clarksville County Market, the kind of morning that couldn't decide between summer and autumn, warm in the sun, sharp in the shade. Dorothy was selling the last of the season's tomatoes and talking to her neighbor Pete about whether the cold was coming early when she noticed the man standing 2 stalls down, looking genuinely uncertain about a jar of honey. Not performing uncertainty. Actually uncertain. He picked it up, read the label, set it down, picked it up again, looked around as though hoping someone might help him make this decision. Dorothy watched this for longer than was strictly necessary. Then she walked over and told him it was good honey and he should just buy it. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize, somewhere between surprised and relieved, and said that was the most straightforward advice he'd received in quite some time. His name was William Ashford. He was 58. He was passing through on his way back to Connecticut from a property matter in Nashville, and had stopped because he was hungry and the market was there. They talked for nearly 2 hours. She found out about the money gradually. The car had told her something, the quality of his jacket had told her something else. But it wasn't what held her attention. What held her attention was the way he listened, not the performed listening of a man waiting for his turn to speak. Actual listening, the kind where you can tell the other person is genuinely adjusting what they think based on what you're saying. She hadn't encountered that in a while. He bought the honey. He bought 3 pounds of tomatoes he almost certainly didn't need, and before he left he asked, with the careful formality of a man who wasn't entirely sure of the protocol, whether she would object to him calling her. She said she wouldn't object. He came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. For 8 months, William Ashford drove from Connecticut to Clarksville and back more times than Dorothy could count. He never arrived empty-handed. Always something small, always something specific to a conversation they'd had the week before. A book she'd mentioned once in passing. A particular type of seed she'd said was hard to find locally. He paid attention. That was the thing, in a way that felt almost old-fashioned. He told her about his life in careful portions. The Ashford family, the estate in Connecticut, the 3 adult children, Richard, Celeste, Miles, from his first marriage, his first wife Margaret, who had died 4 years prior after a long illness. A marriage that had been, in his words, correct in all the ways that matter least. He said that last part quietly, looking at the table, and didn't elaborate. Dorothy didn't push. She had her own portions she offered carefully. Gary, the farm, the 13 years, and the Tuesday morning in March. William listened to all of it without flinching and without offering the kind of hollow comfort that well-meaning people offer when they don't know what else to do. He just said, quietly, simply, that he was sorry that happened to her. And somehow that was exactly enough. She fell in love with him the way you fall in love when you're 52 and have already lived through enough to know the difference between the real thing and the reasonable facsimile. Carefully, completely. With her eyes open, or so she believed. They married on a Thursday afternoon in April. Small ceremony. Her sister Ruth came. Her neighbor Edna sent flowers because the drive was too much for her now. William's children did not attend. He had told her they were busy. She had accepted that. Looking back, she would mark that as the first thing she chose not to examine too closely. The drive to Crestwood Manor took 9 hours. Dorothy watched the landscape change outside the window. Tennessee giving way to Virginia, Virginia to Maryland, Maryland eventually to the particular manicured green of Connecticut money. She had never been to Crestwood before. William had described it as a large house. That was like describing the Atlantic as a fair-sized puddle. The gates alone were taller than her farmhouse. The driveway was a 1/4 mile of perfect gravel, bordered by oak trees so old they'd stopped caring about impressing anyone. The house itself rose at the end of it. Stone and symmetry, and the kind of architecture that announces without raising its voice that the people inside have been significant for a very long time. Dorothy sat in the passenger seat and said nothing. William glanced at her. She told him it was beautiful. He said, and she would remember this later, much later, and understand it differently. He said, "It's very good at looking like what people expect it to be." She thought he meant it as a compliment. Richard, Celeste, and Miles were waiting on the front steps, all 3 of them smiling. Dorothy would spend a long time afterward trying to identify the exact quality of those smiles. They were the right shape, the right duration, everything technically correct about them, but they didn't reach anything. She shook hands with Richard, oldest, tallest, the one who spoke for the group in the way that certain people simply assume the role without it ever being assigned. He said they were so pleased to meet her. He said his father had told them a great deal about her. Celeste kissed her on the cheek and said the house would feel different with someone new in it. Dorothy couldn't decide if that was warmth or a warning. Miles, the youngest, mid-30s, quieter than the other 2, shook her hand and said, "Welcome to Crestwood," and then looked immediately at his father in a way that Dorothy caught and filed away without quite knowing why. They went inside. The marble hallway, the 14-foot ceilings, the particular silence of a house that has always had staff to absorb the noise of daily life. Dorothy smiled and said the right things and felt, for just a moment, like a jar of honey someone had picked up and set back down. That feeling passed. Or rather, she made it pass. She was good at that. William suffered his stroke on a Wednesday morning in October, 6 years into their marriage. Dorothy was in the garden, the small patch of ground on the south side of the house that she'd quietly claimed and turned into something that looked almost like Tennessee if you didn't look too far in any direction. She heard something inside the house. By the time she reached him, he was already on the floor of his study. He died 41 hours later without regaining consciousness. Dorothy sat beside his bed for all 41 of those hours. She held his hand and talked to him about the garden, about the farm, about a Tuesday morning in March that she'd never told anyone the full version of, about all the things she wished she'd said and all the things she was glad she had. Whether he heard any of it, she never knew. The children arrived at the hospital within hours. They were efficient and composed and handled the arrangements with a speed that Dorothy would only later understand had required preparation. You don't move that fast unless you already know what you're going to do. The solicitor's name was Gerald Fitch. He arrived at Crestwood 7 days after William's funeral. Gray suit, soft voice, the kind of man who delivered difficult news with such practiced gentleness that you were halfway through processing the devastation before you realized he hadn't actually apologized for any of it. Dorothy sat across from him in the drawing room, William's drawing room, the one with the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and the fireplace that had never once been cold in 6 years, and listened. Richard sat to her left, Celeste to her right, Miles near the window with his back slightly turned. Gerald Fitch opened his leather folder and began. The will was thorough, she'd give them that. William's estate, the investments, the property portfolio, the various accounts and holdings that Dorothy had never been invited to fully understand, passed to a family trust controlled jointly by Richard, Celeste, and Miles. Gerald Fitch explained this clearly and without rushing. Dorothy nodded slowly and waited for the part that included her. It came near the end. A monthly allowance, $1,200, described in the document as a provision for Dorothy Ashford, beloved wife, ensuring her comfort and security in the years ahead. $1,200 a month. She had seen William spend more than that on a single dinner without noticing he'd done it. She kept her face still. Gerald Fitch was still speaking. There was one additional provision, he said, one asset that fell outside the trust structure and passed directly to Dorothy by name. A property, Hargrove House. He slid a photograph across the coffee table. Dorothy looked at it for a moment without picking it up. Stone walls, boarded windows, grounds that hadn't been maintained in years. A house that looked less like a gift and more like a place where things had been put that nobody wanted to look at anymore. Richard cleared his throat quietly. Dorothy picked up the photograph. She asked one question. She asked whether William had known this was the arrangement. Gerald Fitch said that Mr. Ashford had reviewed and signed the document 18 months prior and had raised no amendments or concerns at any subsequent point. Dorothy set the photograph down. She thanked Gerald Fitch for his time. She stood, excused herself, walked upstairs to the bedroom she had shared with William for 6 years, sat on the edge of the bed, and looked at the wall for a long time. Then she got up and began to pack. She was given 3 days. Richard communicated this through a handwritten note slid under the bedroom door the following morning, which told her something important about the kind of man he was, not cruel enough to say it to her face, not decent enough to feel the need to. She had 3 days, 2 suitcases, and whatever she could carry. She moved through the bedroom methodically. Her clothes, her books, the ones she'd brought from Tennessee, the ones William had given her with small notes written inside the front covers that she folded carefully and packed first before anything else. The photograph of Gary she'd kept on her nightstand for 13 years and brought with her to Crestwood because some things you don't leave behind simply because your life changes direction. She went to the garden on the second morning. The staff watched her from the kitchen window as she crouched in the soil and carefully dug up a cutting from the lavender she'd grown along the south wall. She wrapped the roots in damp cloth and set it inside a ceramic pot she'd bought herself at a market in town. Nobody came out to help her. Nobody came out to say anything at all. Celeste appeared on the final evening. Dorothy was in the hallway with her 2 suitcases lined up by the door when Celeste came down the staircase in the unhurried way of someone who has just remembered an obligation. She said she hoped Dorothy understood that this was simply how William had arranged things. She said she hoped Dorothy would be comfortable at Hargrove House. She said, and here her voice took on the particular warmth of someone performing sincerity for an audience of one, that if Dorothy ever needed anything, she shouldn't hesitate to reach out. Dorothy looked at her for a moment, then she said, quietly, without heat, that she appreciated that. Celeste nodded once and went back upstairs. Dorothy picked up her suitcases and walked out of Crestwood Manor without looking back at the marble hallway, or the 14-foot ceilings, or the garden on the south side of the house where her lavender was still growing along the wall. She didn't look back because she knew if she did, she would cry. And she was not going to cry in that driveway. Not for them. The drive to Hargrove House took 11 minutes. 11 minutes from Crestwood's perfect gravel driveway to the iron gate that ground against the gravel when she pushed it. She sat in the car for a moment after she parked. The house looked worse in person than in Gerald Fitch's photograph. The stone had gone almost black in places with years of damp. One of the ground floor windows had been boarded rather than repaired. The oak tree beside the east wall had grown so close to the building that two of its larger branches rested against the stonework, like something leaning in to listen. She got out of the car. She pushed open the front door with the key Richard had provided. New key, recently cut, which meant someone had been here recently, and she tried not to think too hard about why, and stepped inside. Cold. Immediately and completely cold in the way of a house that has been holding its breath for years. The hallway was long, dark wood floors filmed with dust, a staircase going up on the right, doors leading off to the left, kitchen, sitting room, a small study with empty shelves. She walked slowly, noting things, and then at the end of the hallway she stopped. The basement door, heavy dark wood, old iron handle, a faint smell of something cool and mineral coming from underneath it. Sealed air, dry stone, the particular cold of deep ground. She reached out and touched the handle. It moved. Unlocked. Nothing between her and whatever was on the other side except the weight of the door itself and a feeling she couldn't name. She stood there for a long moment. Then she took her hand off the handle, picked up her suitcases, and went upstairs to find a bedroom that was livable. She spent her first week simply surviving. She found that 3 of the upstairs rooms were in reasonable condition, drafty but structurally sound. She chose the one with the east-facing window because the morning light came through it in a way that reminded her faintly of the farmhouse in Tennessee. She found that the kitchen pipes worked if you ran them for 10 minutes first, that the boiler in the utility room was older than she was, but functional if treated with patience, that the sitting room fireplace drew well once she'd cleared 30 years of debris from the flue. She bought firewood and groceries from a hardware store and a supermarket in the nearest town, Aldermore, population 4,000, the kind of place where a new face was noticed. The woman at the hardware store checkout glanced at her bags and asked if she was moving into the area. Dorothy said she was staying at Hargrove House. The woman's expression did something complicated for just a moment before it settled back into neutral. She said, "Oh." She said that was the old Ashford property, wasn't it? She said she hoped Dorothy would be comfortable there. The same phrase Celeste had used. Dorothy thanked her and carried her bags to the car. She heard the name for the first time 4 days later. She was in the post office collecting a redirect of her mail when 2 older men near the door stopped their conversation as she approached and then resumed it at a lower volume as she passed. She wasn't meant to hear. She heard anyway. "The grave," one of them said. "Somebody's moved into the grave." She didn't turn around. She collected her mail and walked back to the car and sat for a moment with the engine off. The grave. She thought about the basement door, the unlocked handle, the cool mineral smell. She thought about the way Richard had smiled handing her those keys. She drove back to Hargrove House and made herself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the hallway leading to the basement door and thought about William, about what he had and hadn't told her, about the parts of his life she'd accepted in careful portions without pushing for more, about whether the man she'd loved for 13 years had known exactly what his children would do, and whether he had simply let it happen. She found the journal on a Thursday evening in her second week. She was sorting through the bedroom wardrobe, checking for damp, mostly, the kind of practical task that gave her hand something to do when her mind got too loud, when her fingers found it on the upper shelf pushed back against the rear wall. Worn brown leather, no writing on the cover. She brought it to the bedside lamp and opened it. The handwriting inside was not William's. It was a woman's hand. Neat, careful, the letters formed with the particular precision of someone who had learned to write at a time when handwriting was considered a reflection of character. The entries were dated, the earliest from 1981, the latest from 1989. Dorothy read slowly. The woman's name, she gathered from the entries, was Eleanor. She read for 2 hours without stopping. By the time she set the journal down, her tea was cold, and her hands were not entirely steady, because Eleanor, she now understood, had been William's first wife. Not Margaret, the wife William had told her about, the wife who had died 4 years before they met. Eleanor was before Margaret, a wife Dorothy had never been told existed, and Eleanor had lived in this house, had been brought to this house, had written in this journal from this house for 8 years before the entries simply stopped. Dorothy sat very still for a long time. Then she turned to the back cover of the journal and found the letter. It was folded twice. Her name written on the outside in handwriting she would know anywhere, William's handwriting. Her hands were steadier than she expected when she opened it. Dorothy. If you're reading this, then they did exactly what I was afraid they would do. I am sorry. I should have protected you better while I was still here to do it. There are things I didn't tell you, things I told myself I was protecting you from, when the truth is, I was protecting myself from having to say them out loud. I need you to go to the basement. Everything I couldn't say is waiting for you there. Everything you're going to need. Take the small brass key from inside the mantel clock in the downstairs study. The clock on the left. I don't think you ever noticed it. I kept it wound. I'm sorry it took me this long. I love you. I should have said that more. Dorothy read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully, placed it back inside the journal, and sat on the edge of the bed in the east-facing room with the morning light that reminded her of Tennessee. Outside the window, the oak tree moved against the stone wall. She sat there for a long time. Then she got up, went downstairs to the study, and stood in front of the mantel clock on the left. It was old, ornate, the kind of clock that belongs in a house like this, present so long it becomes invisible. She hadn't noticed it. He had kept it wound. She reached into the back of the clock carefully, and her fingers found it immediately. Small, brass, cold. A key. She closed her fingers around it. Then she walked to the end of the hallway and stood in front of the basement door. This time she didn't take her hand away. The key fit. Of course it did. She turned it slowly and felt the lock release with a solidity that told her it had been built to last. Not the cheap hardware of a forgotten storage room, but something deliberate. Something installed by a man who understood that what he was protecting needed to stay protected until exactly the right moment. The door swung inward. The smell reached her first. Cool and dry and faintly mineral. Not the damp rot she'd half expected, but something closer to the inside of a wine cellar. Preserved. Intentional. A stone staircase descended into darkness. She found the light switch on the left wall, a single bulb on a cord that cast a wide yellow circle across the space below. She stood at the top of the stairs and looked down. Then she took the first step. The basement was one large room, stone walls, stone floor, a low ceiling that William, tall man that he was, would have had to mind. Along the far wall, someone had built wooden shelving units, floor to ceiling, solid and carefully constructed. Not recently. This had been here for years. The shelves were not empty. Dorothy stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at what was in front of her and felt something move through her that wasn't quite any single emotion. Not shock, not grief, not anger. Something that contained all of those things without being reducible to any one of them. On the shelves, organized with the quiet precision of a man who did everything quietly and precisely, were boxes, folders, envelopes, stacked and labeled in William's handwriting, dozens of them. She walked closer. The labels were dated. The earliest box she could find was from 1987. The most recent, and she had to steady herself when she saw this, was dated 8 months before his stroke. He had been coming here, all those years at Crestwood, all those dinners and family occasions and evenings in the drawing room while Richard and Celeste talked about the estate and Miles looked out the window. William had been coming here, building this. She didn't know where to start. She stood in the middle of that basement for a full minute just looking. Then she chose the most recent box. It was lighter than she expected. Inside, a manila envelope, sealed, her name written across the front in the same handwriting as the letter upstairs. She opened it carefully. Inside was a document, 12 pages, paper clipped together, dense with legal language but structured clearly. Someone had wanted this to be readable. At the top of the first page, a heading, Last will and testament of William George Ashford, executed this 14th day of February. She checked the date. 14 months before he died. She turned to the second page and began to read. She had to sit down after the third page. There was no chair, so she sat on the stone floor with the document in her lap and her back against the wooden shelving and read it through twice to make sure she was understanding it correctly. She was understanding it correctly. The will Gerald Fitch had read to her in the drawing room, the one that passed everything to the trust, that gave her $1,200 a month and a derelict house, was real. But it was also 18 months old. This document was 14 months old, and it superseded everything that came before it. Under this will, witnessed, signed, legally executed, Dorothy inherited 50% of the Ashford estate outright. Not a monthly allowance, not a property nobody else wanted. Half. The investments, the property portfolio, 50% of the trust assets, and Crestwood Manor. She sat on the cold stone floor and looked at the page until the words stopped swimming. 50%. William had written a new will and told nobody. He had driven to Hargrove House, this house, the house he would one day send her to, and placed it in a basement he had sealed and prepared and left a key hidden inside a clock he kept wound for years, waiting for her. She set the document down carefully on the stone floor beside her. She pressed her palms flat against the cold ground. She breathed. After a while, she reached for the next envelope. This one was thicker, heavier. Financial records, statements going back 15 years, accounts she hadn't known existed, not hidden exactly, but structured in ways that kept them outside the family trust, outside Gerald Fitch's leather folder, outside anything Richard and Celeste and Miles had ever been shown. She was not a financial expert. She understood enough. She understood that William's estate was considerably larger than the version she'd been presented with in that drawing room. She understood that the trust Gerald Fitch had described controlled a portion of William's wealth, and she understood that the portion it didn't control was the larger portion. She set the financial records down beside the will. She reached for the next box. The letters were in a biscuit tin on the middle shelf. She almost missed it. It was smaller than the boxes, pushed slightly behind a folder, the kind of container so ordinary you don't register it as significant. A blue tin with a faded pattern, the sort of thing you'd keep tea in. She lifted the lid. They were bundled in chronological order, elastic bands that had aged to brittleness holding each group together. She counted the bundles. 11. She picked up the earliest bundle and carefully removed the elastic band and unfolded the first letter. It was dated September, 13 years ago, before they'd met. I don't know your name yet. I saw you at the market this morning. You were talking to a man about tomatoes with the particular authority of someone who has grown tomatoes herself and knows when someone is selling inferior ones. I almost spoke to you. I didn't. I'm writing this down because I've learned that I process things better on paper than in my own head. My therapist suggested it years ago, and it's the only advice of hers I've consistently followed. There was something about you I can't properly explain. You looked like someone who knew exactly where they were, like the ground under your feet was genuinely yours. I haven't felt that way about a place in a long time. I'm going back next Saturday. Dorothy read the letter again from the beginning. Then she sat very still for a moment. He had written about her before he'd even spoken to her. She set the letter down on the stone floor, picked up the next one. She read for a long time. The letters from the early months were careful, observational. William writing about their conversations at the market with the precision of someone cataloging something important, what she'd said, what it had made him think, what it had made him remember about himself. He wrote about Crestwood in those early letters with a flatness that told her more than any dramatic language could have. He described family dinners where 3 conversations happened simultaneously, 1 out loud, 2 underneath. He described a house that ran efficiently and felt empty. He described his children with an honesty that was neither cruel nor sentimental. Richard has his mother's gift for making decisions that benefit Richard while appearing to benefit everyone. I used to find it impressive. Now I find it exhausting. Celeste has never once asked me how I am, and meant it. I notice that more lately. Miles is the most like me. That worries me for his sake. She read that last line twice. Then she set the letter down, stood up, walked to the bottom of the staircase and back. Just to move, just to let the stillness release from her joints, and then sat back down and kept reading. The letters changed after their first proper conversation. Something loosened in the writing. The sentences became less controlled. He wrote longer, circling back, crossing out words and writing others above them. She could see the crossings out even in the copies he'd kept. He wrote about her laugh, about the way she handed him the jar of honey without ceremony, about a specific thing she'd said about her farm. She couldn't remember saying it now, but apparently she'd told him that stubborn land teaches you more than easy land, and how he'd thought about that sentence for 3 days afterward. He wrote, and here Dorothy had to stop reading for a moment, he wrote that he had spent 30 years in a house full of people and had been profoundly, completely alone for most of it, and that for the first time in longer than he could properly remember, talking to her had made him feel like a person rather than a function. She set that letter face down on the stone floor. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. Outside, far above her, muffled through stone and floor, the wind moved through the oak tree against the east wall. She sat in that basement and felt the full weight of what William Ashford had been. A man with everything, surrounded by people who wanted what he had. Married twice, once incorrectly, once too late, and quietly, privately, devastatingly lonely for most of his adult life. And he had found her at a market in Tennessee, arguing about tomatoes. And he had driven back every Saturday for 8 months. And he had never once, not in 6 years of marriage, not in 13 years of letters she was only now reading, said the thing clearly enough that she could have heard it without question. He never said I love you once in 6 years. But he spent every one of those years making sure that if something happened to him, nobody could ever take her future away. She found the letter dated 4 months before his stroke near the bottom of the final bundle. It was longer than the others, denser, the handwriting slightly less controlled, not dramatically, but enough that she noticed. He wrote that he'd had a health scare the previous month. Nothing confirmed, but something that had clarified certain things for him with a speed that years of general living had failed to produce. He wrote that he was afraid he had made a mistake bringing her to Crestwood. Not marrying her, never that. But the specific act of walking her into that house without preparing her for what she would find inside it. He wrote, I told myself it would get better, that they would come to know you the way I know you. I watched them not do that for 6 years and kept telling myself the same thing. That is its own kind of cowardice, and I want you to know I understand that. I've been building something for you. I should have told you about it. I kept it from you because I was afraid that telling you would mean saying out loud that I didn't trust my own children, and I didn't want to be the kind of father who says that. But I am the kind of father who says that. I've just been saying it in basements instead of conversations, which is, I recognize, a significant character flaw. Everything you need is below Hargrove House. I chose that property specifically because it has never belonged to them. It was never part of the main estate. It is legally clean and entirely separate, and I made sure of that 15 years ago when I first understood what my children were. The will is there. The records are there. The name of the man who witnessed it is James Calloway. He was my roommate at Yale for 3 years and my closest friend for 50. And the children have never once asked about him because he has nothing they want. Go to James first. He is expecting you. He has a copy of everything. I'm sorry I made you walk into that house alone. I'm sorry it took me this long to say the things I should have said at a Saturday market 13 years ago. You looked like someone who knew exactly where they were. You still do. William Dorothy sat in that basement for a long time after she finished reading. The cold had settled into her bones somewhere in the second hour, but she didn't feel it particularly. She felt something else entirely. Not triumph. Not yet. Something quieter. Something that was grief and love and fury all held in the same hand. For the man who had loved her in letters and records in a carefully prepared basement, instead of in the easy, spoken, ordinary way that would have cost him nothing except the willingness to say it. She understood him completely now. That was the thing she hadn't expected. Understanding him completely didn't make her angry with him. It made her grieve him in a way she hadn't managed to yet. Not the controlled grief of the hospital bedside. not the careful grief of the weeks afterward. The real thing, the full weight of it. She let it come, and she sat with it, and after a while it settled into something she could carry. She looked at the shelves, at the boxes and folders and envelopes, at the biscuit tin with its faded pattern and 11 bundles of letters. She thought about James Calloway in Vermont. She thought about Gerald Fitch's leather folder and Richard's handwritten note slid under a door. She thought about Celeste on the staircase saying, "If you need anything, don't hesitate." She stood up. She gathered the will, the financial records, and the final letter carefully and carried them upstairs. She put the kettle on, and while she waited for it to boil, she picked up her phone and began searching for a man named James Calloway in Vermont. James Calloway answered on the third ring. She hadn't expected that. She'd prepared herself for voicemail, had rehearsed a careful message in her head during the 3 searches it took to find his number, an old listing on a retired judge's directory that hadn't been updated in years, but still had a phone number attached to it. He picked up on the third ring and said his name and waited. Dorothy said, and she kept her voice level. She was proud of that. She said her name was Dorothy Ashford, and she was calling about William. A pause. Not the pause of a man who didn't know the name, the pause of a man who had been waiting for it. He said, quietly, carefully, "Mrs. Ashford, I wondered how long it would take them to show their hand." His voice was older than she'd imagined. 81, William's letter had said. He sounded it, the particular quality of a voice that is slowed down without losing any of its precision. A man who chose his words the way a craftsman chooses tools, deliberately, with full knowledge of what each one is for. He asked her first if she was somewhere private. She said she was in the kitchen of Hargrove House. Another pause. Shorter this time. He said William had told him about Hargrove House. He said he was glad she'd found the basement. She asked him how long he'd known. He said William had first contacted him about the arrangement 11 years ago, that they had met in person 3 times since to review and update the documentation, that the will she'd found in the basement was the 3rd version, each one more precise than the last, as William had come to understand exactly what he was dealing with inside that family. Dorothy looked at the kettle steaming on the counter and thought about 11 years. 11 years of William driving to this house, planning, preparing. 11 years of Sunday dinners at Crestwood, where Richard talked about the estate and Celeste poured wine, and William sat at the head of his own table saying the right things. She asked James Calloway one question. She asked whether William had ever considered simply telling his children what he'd done. James was quiet for a moment. Then he said, he considered it every year. And every year he watched them a little more closely and decided they hadn't yet given him a reason to trust them with it. "Did they ever?" Dorothy asked. "No," James said. "They did not." He told her to find a solicitor before she did anything else. Not the family's solicitor. Not Gerald Fitch with his leather folder and his soft voice. Someone entirely separate. Someone who had no prior relationship with the Ashford estate and no reason to be careful about whose interests they protected. He gave her a name, a woman named Caroline Marsh, a solicitor in Hartford who had handled complex estate disputes for 30 years, and who James described simply as someone who did not enjoy being lied to and was very good at proving it. Dorothy wrote the name down on the back of an envelope. James said he would call Caroline Marsh himself that evening to let her know Dorothy would be in touch. He said he had held a notarized copy of the will and supporting documentation in his own safe for 14 months, and that it was in perfect order. He said one more thing before they finished. He said, "William talked about you a great deal, more than he probably realized he was doing. He was not a man who wore things on his face, but when he talked about you, something happened to his face that he couldn't control." "What did it look like?" Dorothy asked. James Calloway took a moment. "Relief," he said. "It looked like relief." She called Caroline Marsh the following morning. The conversation was efficient and without warmth, not coldly, but in the way of a professional who understood that warmth was not currently what her client needed. She asked precise questions. She listened without interrupting. When Dorothy finished, she was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then she said, "Send me everything from the basement. Copies first, originals later. Don't send anything to anyone else until we've spoken again." Dorothy said she understood. Caroline said one more thing. She said, "Mrs. Ashford, I want to be straightforward with you. If this documentation is what you're describing, the Ashford children have a problem, a significant one. But these processes take time, and they are not always comfortable. Are you prepared for that?" Dorothy thought about 3 days to pack her life into 2 suitcases. She thought about Richard's handwritten note slid under a bedroom door. She thought about Celeste on the staircase saying, "If you need anything, don't hesitate." She said yes. She was prepared for that. She spent the next 4 days carefully photographing every document in the basement. She worked methodically, the same way she'd worked the farm in Tennessee, the same way she'd worked every difficult thing in her life. One task at a time. No rushing, no catastrophizing. Just the next thing, and then the next thing after that. She photographed the will, the financial records, every labeled folder on those shelves. She found things she hadn't looked at properly on her first visit, records going back further than she'd realized, documentation of transactions and arrangements that built a picture of the Ashford estate considerably more complex than anything Gerald Fitch had presented. She packaged the copies carefully and sent them to Caroline Marsh by recorded delivery. Then she sat down and read Eleanor's journal from the beginning. Eleanor Ashford, William's first wife, the wife nobody had mentioned, had come to Hargrove House in the spring of 1981. The journal entries from that first year were careful, measured, a woman writing with the awareness that what she put on paper might be read by someone other than herself. But as the years passed, the carefulness loosened. By 1984, Eleanor was writing plainly. She had not come to Hargrove House to recover. She had been sent here because she had begun asking questions about the family's financial arrangements, specifically about certain transactions involving the estate that she had noticed, and that, when she'd raised them with William, had caused a conversation she described only as the worst evening of her marriage. She didn't blame William entirely. That was what struck Dorothy most. Eleanor wrote about her husband with a clarity that was neither forgiving nor bitter, the precise, complicated assessment of a woman who had understood someone fully and loved them imperfectly. She wrote, "He is not a cruel man. He is a weak one. There is sometimes less distance between those two things than we would like to believe." Dorothy set the journal down for a moment. She looked at the kitchen window, the gray Connecticut sky outside, the oak tree moving in the wind. She picked the journal back up. Eleanor had eventually stopped asking questions, not because she'd found the answers, because she'd understood that asking them inside that house would cost her more than she could afford to keep paying. She had lived at Hargrove House for 11 years. She had never gone back to Crestwood. She had died here, in this house. In, Dorothy calculated, the east-facing bedroom, the bedroom with the morning light that reminded Dorothy of Tennessee. She sat with that for a long time. Caroline Marsh called on a Thursday afternoon 3 weeks after their first conversation. She said the documentation was exactly what Dorothy had described. She said the will was legally sound, properly witnessed, properly executed, no procedural vulnerabilities she could identify. She said James Calloway's notarized copy matched Dorothy's originals precisely. Then she said something that made Dorothy put her hand flat on the kitchen table. She said the financial records from the basement suggested the family trust that Richard, Celeste, and Miles controlled had been drawing on assets that, under William's later will, did not belong to them. Not historically. Not in the distant past. In the 14 months between William signing the new will and his death. Dorothy asked what that meant practically. Caroline was quiet for a moment. Then she said, carefully, precisely, in the voice of a woman who had spent 30 years saying difficult things without sensationalizing them. She said it meant the Ashford children had potentially been managing assets they had no legal right to manage, and that the paper trail William had left in that basement documented it with a thoroughness that suggested he had anticipated exactly this situation. Dorothy said, "He knew they'd move fast when he died." Caroline said, "Mrs. Ashford, based on what I'm looking at, your husband didn't just know they'd move fast. He documented everything they were likely to do before they did it." There was one complication. Caroline raised it on their next call. One of the financial documents, a critical record establishing the full value of an offshore account that formed a significant portion of the estate, existed in the basement only as a partial copy. The final 2 pages were missing. Without them, the account's full value couldn't be formally established in the way the legal process required. William's letter had referenced the account. James Calloway confirmed it existed. But confirmation and documentation were not the same thing. Caroline said she could work around it. But it would be cleaner, significantly cleaner, if they had the complete record. Dorothy asked where the missing pages might be. Caroline said based on the document headers, they appeared to be from a filing held by William's private financial advisor, a man named Thomas Hale, who had managed William's personal accounts, separate from the family trust, for 20 years. Dorothy asked whether Thomas Hale would cooperate. Caroline said she didn't know yet. She said Thomas Hale had been loyal to William. Whether that loyalty extended to William's wishes after his death depended on the man. She said she would reach out to him. Thomas Hale cooperated. He had been waiting, it turned out, in his own way. William had spoken to him 2 years before his death about the possibility of Dorothy making contact. Had told him that if she ever called or if a solicitor called on her behalf, he was to provide whatever documentation he held without hesitation. He sent the complete record to Caroline Marsh within 48 hours of her first contact. He also sent a personal note to Dorothy. It said only, "He spoke about you often. He was a better man for knowing you. I hope this helps." Dorothy folded the note and put it with William's letters in the biscuit tin. 6 weeks after her first call to James Calloway, Dorothy sat across a conference table in Caroline Marsh's Hartford office. The room was quiet and unremarkable, the kind of space designed to drain drama from proceedings that were dramatic enough without additional atmosphere. A window overlooking a car park. A water jug nobody touched. The particular silence of a room where significant things were said in measured tones. Caroline sat to Dorothy's left, a junior colleague to her right. On the table between them, the will, the financial records, the complete offshore account documentation, James Calloway's notarized copies, and Thomas Hale's supporting records. Everything William had built. Everything he had left for her in a sealed basement in a house the family had handed her with barely concealed satisfaction. Caroline set a single sheet of paper in front of Dorothy. She said, "This is what you're entitled to. This is what we're going to proceed with recovering. And this," she set a second sheet beside the first, "is what I believe the Ashford children will say when they find out." Dorothy looked at both sheets. She looked at the number on the first sheet for a long time. Then she looked up at Caroline and said she was ready. Caroline filed the legal challenge on a Monday morning. She did it quietly. No announcements, no preliminary warnings to the other side. Just the documentation submitted to the probate court in the precise, procedural way of someone who had done this enough times to know that the element of surprise was not a dramatic luxury, it was a strategic necessity. Richard, Celeste, and Miles found out through their own solicitor. Caroline told Dorothy they had approximately 48 hours before the response came. She suggested Dorothy use that time to rest. Dorothy went back to Hargrove House and cleaned the kitchen from top to bottom instead. The response came in 36 hours. A letter from a firm in New York. 3 partners listed on the letterhead. The kind of firm whose name alone was designed to communicate that the people who hired them were serious and well-resourced and fully prepared for a prolonged engagement. Caroline called Dorothy after she'd read it. She said the letter was aggressive in tone and thin in substance. She said this was typical of a first response designed to intimidate rather than engage. She said Dorothy should not be alarmed. Dorothy said she wasn't alarmed. She said she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the legal process and everything to do with the fact that she was beginning to understand the full shape of what William had lived inside for 30 years. Caroline was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mrs. Ashford, in my experience, the people who do what your husband did, the quiet, careful, years-long preparation, they do it because they understand that the system won't protect the people they love unless they build the protection themselves." "That's a sad way to live," Dorothy said. "Yes," Caroline said, "it is." The legal process moved in the particular rhythm of these things, periods of intense activity followed by periods of waiting that had their own specific weight. Dorothy learned to inhabit the waiting. She continued working on Hargrove House during those weeks. Not dramatically. She wasn't tearing out walls or making grand gestures. Small things. Practical things. She rehung 2 doors that had dropped on their hinges. She repaired a section of plaster in the upstairs landing. She planted the lavender cutting from her 2-suitcase journey in the ground along the south wall of the house, the same position it had occupied at Crestwood, and watered it every morning. She kept reading Eleanor's journal in the evenings. The full picture of Eleanor Ashford emerged gradually through those pages. Not the outline Dorothy had gathered on her first reading, the bones of what had happened, but the texture of it, the specific daily weight of a life lived in that house under those circumstances. Eleanor had been 26 when she married William. He had been 31. It had been, by Eleanor's account, a marriage of genuine feeling that had slowly been hollowed out by the particular pressures of the Ashford family structure, the expectations, the financial entanglements, the slow understanding that Crestwood Manor was less a home than an institution that had been operating according to its own logic for generations before either of them arrived. She wrote about Richard, Celeste, and Miles as children with a precision that Dorothy found devastating. Richard, at 9 years old, already understood that information was currency. He stored things, waited, used them when the moment was most advantageous. I told William this when Richard was 10, and William said I was being uncharitable. I wonder sometimes if he still thinks that. Celeste performs warmth the way some people perform a second language. Fluently enough that strangers are convinced. Never quite fluently enough that the people who know her can stop noticing the effort. Miles worries me most, not because he is the worst of them, but because he is the most reachable and nobody is reaching him. Dorothy read that last line about Miles twice. She thought about the way he'd looked at his father on the front steps of Crestwood the day she'd arrived. She thought about the way he'd said, "Welcome to Crestwood," and then looked immediately away. She kept reading. The financial questions Eleanor had raised, the ones that had ultimately led to her removal to Hargrove House, became clear through the later journal entries. Eleanor had discovered, through a combination of careful observation and a single conversation with William's private financial advisor of the time, that money was moving through the Ashford estate in ways that didn't correspond to the official accounts. Not large, dramatic amounts. Small, consistent redirections that individually looked like administrative adjustments and collectively looked like something else entirely. She had confronted William. The conversation, the one she'd described only as the worst evening of her marriage, had ended not with resolution, but with William's promise to handle it. He hadn't handled it. Or rather, Dorothy understood now, reading between the lines of Eleanor's careful entries, he had handled it in the way he handled most difficult things. He had removed the immediate source of conflict rather than the underlying cause. He had sent Eleanor to Hargrove House, and the financial irregularities had continued. Dorothy set the journal down one evening and sat with that for a long time. Because here was the thing she had to hold alongside everything else. William had not been perfect. He had been a man who loved genuinely and acted imperfectly. A man who saw injustice clearly and responded to it slowly. A man who had failed his first wife in a specific and consequential way and had spent, she had to believe, the basement told her, the rest of his life trying to understand the cost of that failure. Eleanor's journal ending in 1989 didn't mean Eleanor had stopped existing. It meant she had stopped writing, or stopped being able to. Dorothy went back to the basement the following morning and looked more carefully at the older boxes on the shelves, the ones from the late 80s and early 90s that she'd photographed but not read in detail. She found what she was looking for in a folder dated 1991. It was a collection of documents relating to Eleanor's final years, medical records, financial provisions, letters between William and the staff at Hargrove House during the period of Eleanor's illness, and at the back of the folder, a single handwritten letter from William to Eleanor dated 6 months before her death. Dorothy almost didn't read it. It felt like a private thing, a thing that belonged to 2 people neither of whom were her. She read it anyway, because she understood by now that William had put everything in this basement deliberately. Nothing here was accidental. Nothing here was left without purpose. He had put this here because he wanted her to find it. The letter was not long. William wrote to Eleanor with the careful formality of 2 people who had been many things to each other and had arrived at something that was neither love nor its absence, but a complex, truthful thing in between. He wrote that he was sorry, not performatively, not with the elaborate architecture of a man trying to absolve himself, just directly and plainly. I am sorry for what happened to you. I am sorry for the part I played in it. I am sorry I chose the easier thing when the harder thing was what you deserved. He wrote that he had spoken to the children about their behavior toward her during her years at Hargrove House, and that the conversation had confirmed things he had been avoiding confirming for too long. He wrote, I have been a poor excuse for a man in certain specific ways that matter enormously. I cannot undo what was done to you. I can only try to make sure it is not done again to someone else I am responsible for. I intend to do that. I don't expect your forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. I just needed you to know that I see it clearly now, whatever that's worth. There was no record of whether Eleanor had replied. Dorothy folded the letter and held it in both hands for a moment. Then she placed it carefully back in the folder. She understood now why William had chosen Hargrove House specifically. Not as cruelty, not even simply because it was legally clean and separate from the estate. He had chosen it because it was Eleanor's ground. Because Eleanor had lived and suffered and ultimately died in this house, and William had carried that quietly, privately, in the way he carried everything, for 30 years. He had given Dorothy the one place on the entire Ashford estate that contained his clearest accounting of himself, the place where he had been most honestly wrong, and in doing so had left her the most honest version of who he was. She sat in that basement surrounded by 30 years of a man's careful reckoning with himself and felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't felt since she'd arrived in Connecticut. Not happiness, exactly. Something sturdier than happiness. Caroline called 2 weeks later with news that changed the shape of everything. The opposing legal team, the three-partner New York firm, had requested a meeting, not a court date. A meeting. Caroline said this was significant. She said in her experience, firms like that didn't request meetings when they believed they were going to win. Dorothy asked what it meant. Caroline said it meant Richard, Celeste, and Miles had looked at the documentation William left in that basement and had spoken to their own legal team and had arrived at an understanding that Dorothy was prepared to let them arrive at on their own time. It meant they knew. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday. Dorothy drove to Hartford the evening before and stayed in a small hotel near Caroline's office. She had dinner alone at a restaurant around the corner. Soup, bread, a glass of wine she nursed for an hour, while the dinner service moved around her. She thought about William. She thought about a Saturday market in September 13 years ago. A man genuinely uncertain about a jar of honey. 2 hours of conversation beside a vegetable stall. The 8 months of careful Saturdays that followed. She thought about the drive to Crestwood. The gates, the driveway, the 3 children on the front steps with their technically correct smiles. She thought about 6 years of learning which windows sealed and which pipes needed patience and which conversations at that long formal dining table were happening on the surface and which ones were happening underneath. She thought about 41 hours beside a hospital bed talking to a man who couldn't answer. She thought about 2 suitcases, and a lavender cutting wrapped in damp cloth, and a basement full of 30 years of love expressed in the only language William Ashford had ever been fully fluent in. She finished her wine, she went back to the hotel and slept better than she had in months. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Caroline sat beside her. The 3-partner New York firm sat across the table, silent. 2 of the partners present, the 3rd apparently unavailable. Richard sat between them. Celeste to his right. Miles at the far end of the table, slightly apart from the others, in a way that Dorothy noticed immediately. The legal team spoke first. The language was procedural and dense and designed, Dorothy understood, to create the impression that what was happening was a technical negotiation rather than an acknowledgement of what had actually been done. She let them speak. She watched Richard. He was controlled, composed. His father's son in the specific way that certain qualities pass down through generations, whether they're wanted or not. He listened to his own legal team with his hands flat on the table and his face arranged into the careful neutrality of a man who understood he was being observed. But there was something underneath it. Dorothy had spent 6 years watching Richard Ashford's face across a dining table. She recognized what underneath it looked like. He was afraid. Not of her specifically. Afraid of the basement. Afraid of what his father had seen and recorded and sealed away for 30 years. Afraid, and this was the part Dorothy found most human, most recognizable, most genuinely sad, afraid of what it meant that his father had known exactly who he was and had loved him anyway, and had still built those shelves and filled those boxes and locked that door. The meeting moved toward its conclusion. Caroline outlined Dorothy's position clearly and without theater. The opposing team responded, numbers were discussed, structures were proposed, and then Dorothy, who had said almost nothing for 2 hours and 30 minutes, spoke. She said she had one thing to add before they concluded. The room adjusted its attention toward her. She said she had no interest in a prolonged legal battle. She said she had no interest in destroying the family William had spent his life trying to hold together despite everything. She said she understood that grief made people act in ways they might later reconsider, and that she was prepared to factor that understanding into what she was willing to accept. She said she wanted what William had intended her to have. Not as punishment, not as victory, simply because it was right. And because William had spent 30 years making sure it was documented clearly enough that right and legal meant exactly the same thing in this particular instance. She said she was prepared to be reasonable about the timeline and structure of the settlement provided the fundamental terms were not negotiated. She looked at Richard when she said that last part. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked down at the table. The meeting ended without a resolution. Not badly, not with raised voices or walked-out chairs. It simply ended the way certain important conversations end, with both sides understanding what the other side holds, and needing time to decide what to do with that understanding. Caroline walked Dorothy to her car afterward. She said the meeting had gone as well as it could have gone at this stage. She said the opposing team would go back to their clients, and the clients would have a conversation, and that conversation would determine the next step. She said, "You were very calm in there." Dorothy said she hadn't felt calm. Caroline said, "That's usually when it counts most." She drove back to Hargrove House in the early evening. The light was doing something particular to the stone walls as she pulled through the iron gate, a low autumn gold that made the house look, for just a moment, like something other than what it had been when she'd first arrived. Less like a place things had been sent to be forgotten, more like a place that had simply been waiting for the right person to notice it. She parked and sat in the car for a moment, then she went inside and fed the cat. She had acquired the cat 3 weeks into her time at Hargrove House, a gray, opinionated animal that had appeared at the kitchen door one morning and declined to leave. She'd named him William, which she felt was either deeply appropriate or completely inappropriate, and couldn't decide which. The cat accepted his dinner without gratitude and went to sit in front of the fire. Dorothy made tea and sat at the kitchen table and waited. Richard arrived on a Saturday morning, 11 days after the Hartford meeting. No advance notice, no call, no letter, no message through the legal teams, just his car appearing on the gravel outside Hargrove House at 10:30 on a gray November morning. Dorothy saw him from the kitchen window. She watched him sit in the car for a moment before getting out, watched him look at the house with an expression she couldn't read from that distance, watched him straighten his jacket before walking to the front door. She waited for the knock. It came. She opened the door. Richard stood on the step in a dark coat, no tie, his hair slightly less controlled than his usual presentation. He looked, and this was the thing she hadn't expected, he looked tired, not strategically tired. Actually, tired. The specific exhaustion of someone who had not been sleeping well and had stopped trying to hide it. He said good morning. She said good morning. A beat of silence. She stepped back from the door and said, "Come in, I'll put the kettle on." He stood in the kitchen doorway while she filled the kettle, not sitting, not committing to the visit in that way yet. Looking at the room, the fire, the cat, the lavender cutting on the windowsill that had put out new growth in the weeks since she'd potted it. He said, "You've made it livable." She said, "It wasn't as bad as it looked." He said, "It was pretty bad." She glanced at him. Something in his face shifted. The ghost of something that might have been humor if there had been any room for it. It disappeared as quickly as it arrived. She set 2 cups on the table and sat down. After a moment, he sat opposite her. He didn't speak immediately. She didn't fill the silence. She had learned, from 30 years of Tennessee stubbornness, from 6 years of Crestwood dinner tables, from 41 hours in a hospital room, that silence was not something you were required to rescue. Sometimes silence was the most honest thing in the room, and interrupting it was just a way of avoiding what it contained. Richard looked at his hands on the table. Then he looked up. He said, "I want you to know that I didn't know about the first will. The real one. I want you to know that." Dorothy looked at him steadily. She said, "Which part are you saying you didn't know about?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Any of it." She held his gaze. She said, "Richard, I've read 30 years of your father's records. I've read what he saw, what he documented, what he understood about this family, and when he understood it." She paused. "I'm not asking you to confess anything. I'm not a court, but I'd ask you not to sit in this kitchen and tell me things that aren't true. Not here." He looked at the table again. A long silence. Then, quietly, without looking up, he said, "We knew the estate was larger than what Fitch presented. We didn't know about the second will. We thought—" He stopped. Started again. "We thought there was more. We thought we'd found most of it. We didn't know he'd—" Another stop. Dorothy waited. "We didn't know he'd been this careful," Richard said finally. She poured the tea. The ordinary domesticity of it seemed to release something in the room, some of the careful architecture that both of them had been maintaining since he knocked on the door. Richard wrapped both hands around his cup. He said, "What do you want, Dorothy?" Not aggressively, not strategically. The question of a man who had run out of more sophisticated approaches and arrived at the plain one. She said, "I want what your father intended me to have." He said, "And the other things? The financial records, the documentation of the—" He chose his next word carefully. "Irregularities." Dorothy looked at him. She said, "Your father documented those things. He understood what they were. He chose not to act on them while he was alive for reasons I think you probably understand better than I do." She paused. "I'm not your father. I don't have 30 years of history with this family to weigh against what those records show. What I have is a solicitor who has read them and an understanding that they exist and are documented clearly." "Are you threatening me?" Richard asked. His voice was even. The question genuine rather than confrontational. Dorothy said, "I'm telling you what I have. What you do with that information is your decision." Richard was quiet for a long time. Outside the kitchen window, the November morning had gone flat and gray. The lavender on the windowsill sat small and determined in its pot. 3 months of careful watering showing in the new growth along its stems. Richard looked at it. He said, "My father loved gardens." Dorothy said, "I know." He said, "He used to spend Sunday mornings in the Crestwood garden before any of us were up. I'd see him from my bedroom window when I was a boy, just walking around out there. I never understood what he was doing." Dorothy said, "Just looking at it, I expect." Richard nodded slowly. "Just looking at it," he said. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. Not comfortable exactly, but honest. The silence of two people sitting with something true between them without trying to manage it into a more convenient shape. He asked about Eleanor. Not directly. He came at it sideways, the way people approach things they're not sure they have the right to approach. He said he knew she'd found the older records in the basement. He said he'd been very young when Eleanor had been moved to Hargrove House. He said he had understood as a child that something had happened but had never been told what. Dorothy looked at him carefully. She said, "How old were you?" He said, "8." She said, "Did you ask your father about it?" He said, "Once." He said Eleanor needed to rest somewhere quiet. I was 8. I believed him. A pause. "I didn't ask again," he said. Dorothy said nothing. Richard said, Was she all right in the end?" Dorothy thought about Eleanor's journal, the later entries, the handwriting that had changed over the years, not dramatically, just the gradual shift of someone learning to take up less space. She said, "She was honest in her writing. That takes a certain kind of strength." Richard nodded. He didn't ask anything else about Eleanor. Dorothy understood that there were things he wasn't ready to know yet. That readiness was its own process and couldn't be hurried by someone else's timeline. He left an hour after he'd arrived. He stood at the front door with his coat on and his hands in his pockets and looked at the house the way he'd looked at it from his car, with an expression Dorothy still couldn't fully read, but which had something of reckoning in it. He said, "I'll speak to our legal team on Monday." She said, "All right." He said, "Dorothy." He stopped. She waited. He said, "I don't think any of us ever—" Another stop, longer this time. He looked at the ground. Then he said, "He was better when you were there at dinners and things. He was more present. I noticed that." Dorothy looked at him steadily. She said, "He was a good man who made some poor choices. I think you know that." Richard said, "Yes. Just that. Just yes." He walked to his car. She stood in the doorway and watched him go. The gravel crunched under his feet. The iron gate ground on its hinge as he pushed it open. He got in the car. He sat for a moment before starting the engine, the same way he'd sat when he arrived, as though the car was the one place in this entire situation where he could be still for a moment without it meaning something. Then he drove away. Dorothy stood in the doorway until the sound of his engine faded entirely. Then she went inside. The cat was sitting in the middle of the kitchen floor, looking at her with the particular judgmental composure of an animal that has witnessed something significant and reserved its opinion. She told him it was fine. He didn't appear convinced. She sat at the kitchen table where Richard's cup still sat, tea half finished, the rim leaving a faint ring on the wood. She wrapped both hands around her own cup, still warm. Outside, the gray morning had softened slightly, a thin light pushing through the cloud cover. Not much, just enough. She looked at the lavender on the windowsill. The new growth along the stems was pale green and tender and absolutely certain of itself. She sat there for a long time, not thinking about the legal process or the Hartford meeting or what Richard would say to his solicitors on Monday. Just sitting, just breathing, just being in a room that was slowly, stubbornly, in the particular way of things that take root in difficult ground, beginning to feel like hers. The settlement was finalized on a Tuesday afternoon in February. 4 months after Dorothy had sat on a cold basement floor reading a will she hadn't known existed. 4 months after a phone call to an 81-year-old man in Vermont who had answered on the third ring and said he'd been waiting. Caroline called her with the news at 3:30. She said the terms were exactly what they'd sought. 50% of the Ashford estate, the investments, the property portfolio, the full accounting of assets that Gerald Fitch's leather folder had so carefully not mentioned. A formal legal acknowledgement that the will presented at Crestwood 7 days after William's funeral did not represent his final wishes. In Crestwood Manor. Dorothy thanked her. Caroline said, "It was William's work. I just carried it across the finish line." Dorothy said, "We both know that's not entirely true." Caroline said, "No, but it's a nice thing to say." She didn't move back into Crestwood immediately. People assumed she would. Caroline assumed it. James Calloway assumed it when she called to tell him. Even the woman at the hardware store in Aldermore who had watched Dorothy's face do something complicated at the mention of Hargrove House seemed to assume that the natural conclusion of the story was Dorothy returning in triumph to the grand estate. But Dorothy had been at Hargrove House for 5 months by then. She knew which pipes needed patience. She knew the particular quality of the morning light in the east-facing bedroom. She knew the sound the oak tree made against the stone wall in a strong wind. Not threatening, she'd decided, more like company. She had planted things. The lavender along the south wall had survived the winter and was putting out growth with the determined energy of something that had decided this ground suited it. She had started a kitchen garden along the east wall, modest, practical, the same instinct that had driven her hands into Tennessee soil since she was old enough to follow her father across the lower field. She had, without fully intending to, made a home. She took her time with Crestwood. She visited it twice before making any decisions about it, walked through the rooms with Caroline and a property advisor, a practical, unsentimental woman named Helen who assessed things with an honest eye and didn't tell Dorothy what she thought she wanted to hear. The marble hallway, the 14-foot ceilings, the drawing room with the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves where Gerald Fitch had opened his leather folder and changed the shape of her life, the garden on the south side of the house where her lavender still grew along the wall. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at it for a long time. She decided she would keep Crestwood. Not to live in. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. That was a decision that didn't need to be made immediately. But to keep. Because it had been William's, and because certain things you don't let go of simply because they're complicated. She arranged for the garden to be properly maintained. She arranged for the lavender to be left exactly where it was. Richard and Celeste accepted the settlement without further challenge. Their legal team had advised them, Dorothy understood through Caroline, that the documentation William had left in that basement was simply too thorough, too precise, too clearly the work of a man who had understood exactly what he was doing and had done it with 30 years of careful patience. There was nothing to challenge that wouldn't make things considerably worse. Celeste sent a letter, 2 paragraphs, formally worded. It acknowledged the settlement and expressed, in the careful language of someone who had chosen every word with legal awareness, that she hoped the matter could be considered resolved. Dorothy read it twice. Then she set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a moment. She wrote back 1 paragraph. She said she considered it resolved. She said she hoped Celeste was well. She said, and she meant this, which surprised her slightly, that she held no ongoing ill will. She sent it before she could reconsider the last part. Miles called her in March, not through solicitors, not through formal channels, just a phone call on a Wednesday evening from a number she didn't recognize that turned out to be Miles Ashford calling from what sounded like a car park somewhere. He said, "I just wanted to say I'm sorry." No preamble, no legal qualification, just that. Dorothy sat down at the kitchen table. She said, "What are you sorry for specifically?" He said, "For not saying anything. When you arrived at Crestwood. When all of it was happening, I could see what was happening and I didn't say anything." Dorothy said, "Why didn't you?" A long pause. He said, "Because I didn't know how to be different from them. I'd spent my whole life inside that family, and I didn't know how to do something they wouldn't do." Another pause. "That's not an excuse," he said. "I know that's not an excuse." Dorothy looked at the lavender on the windowsill. Nearly 6 months in its pot now. Roots established, stems strong, the kind of quiet permanence that comes to things that have been properly tended. She thought about what Eleanor had written about Miles. "Miles worries me most, not because he is the worst of them, but because he is the most reachable, and nobody is reaching him." She said, "I appreciate the call, Miles," he said. I know it doesn't fix anything." She said, "No, but it's not nothing either." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He talked about you, Dad, more than I think he knew he was doing. He'd mentioned something you'd said or something you were doing in the garden, and he'd get this." He paused. "He just looked different when he talked about you," Miles said. "He looked like himself." Dorothy pressed her hand flat against the kitchen table. She said, "Thank you for telling me that." They talked for another 20 minutes. Nothing dramatic, just 2 people finding their way carefully towards something that wasn't quite forgiveness yet, but was perhaps the ground that forgiveness might eventually grow from. She didn't know if Miles would call again. She thought he might. James Calloway came to visit in April. He drove from Vermont himself. Dorothy had offered to send a car. He had declined with the polite firmness of a man who had been managing his own affairs for 81 years and saw no reason to stop. He arrived on a Thursday morning in a sensible dark car, moving carefully but without frailty, a tall man gone thin with age who shook her hand with both of his and looked at her with eyes that had clearly been assessing people for decades. He stood in the hallway of Hargrove House and looked around. He said, "He described this place to me once, said it was the only property on the estate that had never been used for anything dishonest. Dorothy said, "That's why he chose it." James said, "That's why he chose it." She showed him the basement. He stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at the shelves, the boxes still in their places, the folders still labeled in William's handwriting, the biscuit tin on the middle shelf. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "He spent a long time on this." Dorothy said, "I know." He said, "He was a better man at the end than he was in the middle. I think he knew that. I think he was trying to account for the middle." Dorothy said, "Eleanor's journal is upstairs, if you ever wanted to read it." James looked at her. He said, "Did you find what you needed in it?" She said, "I found what he needed me to find in it. I think that's why he left it here." James nodded slowly. They went upstairs and she made lunch, and they sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours talking about William Ashford. The full version, the complicated version, the one that contained both the basement and the 30 years of dinners where he'd sat at the head of his own table saying the right things. James told her things about William she hadn't known, small things, private things. The particular way he'd laughed at something genuinely funny, rare enough that James had noticed every time. The fact that he'd kept a photograph of Dorothy in his wallet that he'd shown James once without comment, and then put away again as though he'd revealed more than he'd intended. Dorothy laughed at that. The first real laugh she'd had in, she couldn't remember how long. James smiled at her across the table. He said, "There it is." She asked what he meant. He said, "You laughed like someone who meant it." He said that was the first thing he noticed. She called her sister Ruth that evening. Ruth, who had come to a small Thursday afternoon wedding and sent flowers because the drive was too much for Edna. Ruth, who had called every week since William's death and listened without advice and asked the right questions and wrong ones in equal measure and been exactly what a sister is supposed to be. Dorothy told her everything, the whole of it, the basement, the letters, the biscuit tin, James Calloway on the third ring, Caroline Marsh's conference table, Richard at the kitchen door with his coat on and his hands in his pockets. Ruth was quiet for a long time when Dorothy finished. Then she said, "He loved you properly. He just didn't know how to do it out loud." Dorothy said, "No, he did it in basements." Ruth said, "Well," a pause. "Some people never do it at all," Ruth said. On a morning in late April, Dorothy drove to the county market in the nearest town. Not Clarksville. Not the market where she'd met William on a September Saturday 13 years ago. A different market in a different county in a different chapter of her life. But the same kind of morning. Warm in the sun, sharp in the shade. The particular light of a season that hasn't quite committed to itself yet. She walked between the stalls. She bought tomatoes from a man who had clearly grown them himself. She could tell from the way he talked about them, the specific pride of someone who knew exactly what had gone into what they were selling. She bought honey. She stood for a moment at the edge of the market with her bag and her tomatoes and her honey and looked at the people moving around her. She thought about a man standing 2 stalls down, looking genuinely uncertain about a jar of honey. Not performing uncertainty. Actually uncertain. She thought about walking over and telling him it was good honey and he should just buy it. She thought about 2 hours of conversation beside a vegetable stall, and 8 months of Saturdays and a 9-hour drive to Connecticut, and 6 years of learning which pipes needed patience, and which conversations were happening on the surface, and which ones underneath. She thought about a basement full of 30 years of love expressed in the only language he'd ever been fully fluent in. She thought about what Ruth had said. Some people never do it at all. The market moved around her. Voices and footsteps and the particular living noise of people going about their ordinary Saturday morning. Dorothy stood in the middle of it and felt, not happiness exactly, though happiness was somewhere in it, something sturdier than happiness, something that had roots. She drove back to Hargrove House, through Aldermore, past the hardware store, through the iron gate that still ground on its hinge. She'd been meaning to oil it for months and kept finding other things to tend to first. She parked and got out and stood for a moment looking at the house. The stone walls had lost their gray severity somewhere in the winter months. She wasn't sure exactly when, just that one morning she'd looked at them and they'd looked different, less like something turned away from. more like something settled. She went inside. The cat was on the kitchen windowsill beside the lavender mint, an arrangement he'd established weeks ago and showed no intention of reconsidering. He glanced at her with the complete indifference of an animal who has decided where he lives and considers the matter closed. She put the tomatoes on the counter. She set the honey beside them. She looked at the hallway leading to the basement door. She thought about going down there. She'd been back several times since the settlement. Not urgently, not searching for anything new. Just going down and standing among the shelves for a few minutes. Being with the careful evidence of a man who had loved her in the only way he knew how. She went to the kitchen window instead. The lavender along the south wall had come back stronger than last year. She'd known it would. Lavender is like that. Cut it back in autumn and it returns in spring with more determination than it left with. She pressed her palm against the cool glass and looked at it. Outside, the oak tree moved against the stone wall. Not threatening, just company. If you've ever loved someone who showed it in actions rather than words, or if you've ever been the person who didn't know how to say it out loud, leave a comment below. I'd like to know your story. And if this is the kind of story that stays with you, subscribe. There are more of them. This is a fictional story created for entertainment and inspirational purposes only. All characters, names, locations, and events depicted are entirely fictitious. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. This video is produced in full compliance with YouTube's community guidelines and terms of service.